As people develop their questions, I guess I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and tee one up, because I don't see anybody at the microphones. And I think each of you made a comment that there's a lot of promise in these tools, that Bernie, you made the comment that it takes time to implement some of the changes. You've referred to some of the documents. There's also the Science and Decisions document, which I think is very relevant in the sense of its focus on a solution-driven assessment. That's, what's the problem you're trying to solve? So my question is, how do we also heard of the urgency for the need for this kind of assessment. So how do we keep a real sustainability and health assessment from becoming, if you will, the cellulosic ethanol of environmental health that's just 5 years away and always has been and always will be? Who has the responsibility, and how do we get this process started?
Well, one thing that we focused on in the book is examples where the process already has started. I mean, there's lots of good examples of that. One that it has just what you said, the issue of putting benefits in there is a New York City school system one, and I'm biased, and I have 4 grandchildren in that system, in which they have a $1.1 billion bill facing them to replace their PCB containing light fixtures in the school system. The only way they can do that is to lay off school teachers. But when they finally worked it through, they were able to replace the light fixtures with LED light, low-energy lights. The savings in their capital budget from that meant that it could be done without laying off school teachers. Again, EPA had to be flexible in its response, but that's a beneficial effect, taking into account the benefits and working across these various different systems, and obviously had to work closely with the various environmental groups and school groups to make sure that occurred, so all the stakeholders had to be involved. And I hope that one still holds, because these things go back and forth. But these are the kind of examples which you'll find throughout the book. Work is being done. Lots of people at least in EPA, and I'm sure in other agencies, really want to do this. But they just don't have a framework, a setting which allows them to move forward as readily as they could if some sort of framework was in front of them.
One of my favorite quotes is, "Don't catch up, leap ahead." And as we come into the 21st century, I mean, Bernie, this is a classic example of not using 20th century solutions to solve 20th century problems.
I would say that what needs to happen is that people just need to start doing them, and not through waiting for congressional mandates or waiting for administrative requirements from an OMB or something like that, but instead trying to find creative ways to be able to start doing them, and such as leveraging some of the private sector efforts in this area, perhaps leveraging interest by industry in this area. But I think that if we can see movement forward to some of these assessments, as Dick said, on important problems, that will end up inspiring those administrative changes that need to happen, which are going to take longer to make happen. I think that you're going to have to persuade, though, by example, lead by example, not through the process of saying, okay, how do we... I mean, I could see 20 years of EPA FACAs trying to work this out, which I don't think that we really have.
Thanks very much. Do we have a question at the microphone? Great. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you for a great presentation. My name is Rebecca Rear. I am an ASPH Environmental Health Fellow at the EPA. And most of the presentations that we've heard today have used the word sustainable or sustainability, and there seems to be consensus that it involves a concept, or a consensus that involves protecting resources for future generations. But I worry sometimes that focusing on a distant concept of future generations, we can overlook children today. And we want to remember that children are not a susceptible subpopulation, but rather can be viewed as a series of life stages through which everyone passes. So I was wondering if you could comment on any of the tools that you've mentioned today that are specifically looking at this concept of life stages and are working to protect children.
Well, you're in a sense preaching to the converted, so it's not really fair because Dick and I have spent the greater part of our 2 careers working on that very issue. So, but I would say that it's embedded, it needs to be embedded in all the things that we were talking about, from nutrition, if you're thinking about that, the special nutritional requirements that children have, that pregnant women have, all the way through, you know, some of the comments that I made about the need for adequate energy supplies to even just in a lot of the world free children from backbreaking work that they're doing just gathering wood and other things that are needed, you know, and dung and other things needed for household energy. When children work that way, they use all of their energy to work. It affects their growth, it affects their ability to learn. So we certainly have to keep them in mind with all of these issues.
You know, one of the fascinating things about sustainability and nothing is sustainable. Every single thing that we do has an impact. And really what we've got to do is figure out how to have the maximum positive impact and the least negative impact. And the reason I ended my little tour of the mall with the botanical garden is I think our children deserve contact with nature. They deserve a world that is as beautiful and diverse and healthful, at least as good as we are given, and hopefully more than we are given. And because we're not going to do it perfect, and some of the things we do are going to be negative, but we've got to maximize that which we can do that is positive for them.
Thank you. Next question.
Hey, Al McGartland. Speaking about sustainability analysis obviously gets my juices flowing since I'm an economist and do analysis for a living. How would you, as a first cut, I mean, to tie back, we did a fracking conference not too long ago, and T. Boone Pickens is sort of lobbying for natural gas as a solution for some of our transportation fuels. What's the boundaries that you would sort of attack this problem, not problem, but challenge in terms of an analytic construct?
I mean, Al, so, you know, one thing that I think needs to be said is that we don't truly have a national energy policy. And so in some ways, you know, when we plan a workshop, it's constrained by pretty narrow boundaries. Here we are, we're talking about one kind of fuel, biofuels, and then we had another one where we talked about one way of producing fuel, fracking. But the thing is that we don't truly have a set of broad objectives for getting from point A, where we are now, to where, say, Lester Brown says we should try to be in 2020. Some people would say 2050, or whatever time period you want to talk about, where we're even stabilizing the climate of the planet. And so it's hard to draw boundaries when we're in that kind of a situation. I mean, I'd love to have your ideas about that.
Let me add now that whenever I do this presentation, this slide set, I just gave you a very small part of it. The last picture of my slide set on presenting about that sustainability, about the Green Book, is a picture of a drilling rig in West Virginia and a question about how do we apply these principles to something like fracking. And I can tell you that when I do my at least once a week talk on fracking, I end with a discussion of sustainability. I can assure you that at least in southwestern Pennsylvania, there's been almost no talk of sustainability in fracking.
Al, did you want to go back, and you were asked if you had a suggestion about boundaries? And then we'll take the next question.
I think you guys both hit it where I was, at least. I'd struggle, I think, within the agency because both problems are large. So on the one hand, you know, analysts like to define boundaries that are manageable, but on the other hand, I wouldn't want to leave something so major off the table when we're trying to think about maybe a national energy policy or a direction to go. So I don't have an answer. But
I mean, let me make one other comment, and from my time at the agency, but Bernie was also involved in this, and that is when I was at EPA, because I had the chemicals area, for a considerable amount of time, I had to spend a lot of time on a single chemical, MTBE, a single fuel additive, completely out of context of the broader issues of energy policy and what that was for, because of the concerns about that. Frankly, political constraints at that time on the agency, which I think occurred a day with concern about the Clean Air Act and all the good things the Clean Air Act does, and not wanting to reopen the Clean Air Act in a bad political climate. I think that's going on perhaps today. And it's very, very difficult, those of you who work in government, to be able to go beyond that when you have a job to do that sometimes is extremely constrained. And that's part of why I think I've been so committed to the concept of this roundtable and the ability to pull up to a different level, to be able to see these issues in a broader context, which you rarely have the chance to do when you're in the government.
Just one quick thing. My belief is that to the extent that sustainability assessment moves forward at EPA, it is going to move forward much more rapidly at the regions than it will here in Washington.
Just
I accept that challenge,
one of the excellent accomplishments in environmental public health has been around right to know. And when there has to be disclosure of what the exposures are, who is exposed, how much, what's happening. And nowadays, with the power of the computers and the amount of data that people can get to, I think it's going to be so important that there be much more disclosure. To have, I don't know the numbers, but 50,000 drilling rigs in Pennsylvania and have virtually no one knowing what is going on, where it is, what are the releases, how many people are getting sick, how much water is being put into the rivers, how much fossil water is not being returned to the earth. I mean, that's information that is absolutely the public's right to know. And there are lots of other things we need to do, but making sure people have access to that is a very important first step.
Great, thank you very much. Very excellent points. Next question, Dr.
Actually, Luz Claudio, member of the Roundtable, and actually that was one of my points. You mentioned the complexity of reading an environmental impact statement, and add to that, looking into health impact assessment, the complexity of how that information can be useful. Do you have any recommendations specifically on enacting the health impact assessment portion of that and how that can be translated to communities and the public and policymakers to be useful? It seems to me that that would be the logical step in an ideal world.
We're just finishing up a health impact assessment in Los Angeles for the new subway. It's about 100 pages. It's written in absolutely the most understandable language, and it captures multiple domains of both risk and services. And yeah, you're not going to put a subway in without having negative impacts in various areas of various kinds. And there'll be positive ones, and you got to look at them over time. But a well-educated layperson can read this quite comfortably. It's not out yet. We're still reviewing every last word in the draft, but it's only 100 pages, and it will really, I hope, help inform a big, important decision.
Hi, Patty Bright with the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm standing in for Suzette Kimball, who's one of your roundtable members. Dr. Goldstein and I were actually talking at lunch about some of the challenges that we're facing in trying to do a health impact with our folks who are doing uranium assessments. And so, although I don't know anything about biofuels, this has been really fascinating for me because I can see a lot of the challenges that are being faced here are the same ones we face. And, I think, Dr. Goldman, as you mentioned, it's easy to focus on each of these individual issues, and it would be great if this roundtable could think about how to kind of capture some of these lessons learned, and is there kind of this greater toolbox that we could take forward, since we're certainly going to need to do that, not only on the energy side, but on the mineral side as well. So, thank you.
The microphones look suspiciously abandoned. Last call for questions. I'm sure there are some. I have some, but I think given the weather and given the discussion and the excellent points that we've made and the opportunity to have our next panel, which will have some inputs and some feedback from government agencies, and then the opportunity for Frank Loy to close and provide us with those next steps forward and the learnings from this, I think we'll adjourn this session and go to break.
Back at 2.
So why don't we plan on coming back at roughly 2 o'clock, 5 after 2. Thank you. And once again, a round of applause for our speakers.